You're good.
All good. Beautiful.
Good morning, good evening, good night. Welcome back to the Rugby Site Podcast. We're joined with two very special guests today, Alastair Rogers and Dr. Michael Lauren. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah, you're welcome. So pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Do you want to give the listeners a bit of a brief background on your involvement in rugby and in coaching and high performance sport? Start with you, Al.
Al Rogers. I was the All Black analyst from 2008 through to 2015. So those two World Cup cycles. Coaching is my background in professional rugby, and then I kind of went back into coaching, and then had the pleasure of coaching the Blues Samoa national team, and spent a couple of years in Japan. In Fiji with the Drua, and now I'm over in the UK. So much travelled.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm Michael Lauren. My background's actually as a physicist, but for the last couple of decades, I've been working for the Defence Force, and my role there is to actually look at tactics and what constitutes good performance, or how you get the best out of your forces. And I've been extremely privileged over the years to have had contact with the likes of great coaches like Al, but also people like Wayne Smith, just looking at how you can apply some of those ideas in a rugby setting.
So if we elaborate on that point, can you take us back to how you first initially drew the connection between military and rugby and how they sort of tied together?
Yeah, I think people kind of have this intuitive notion that rugby and the military or warfare sort of kind of have analogies, but I mean, obviously they are very different things. But you hear sort of people talking. You often hear the terminology trench warfare when people are talking about a particular really tight game of rugby, and I think what they're really talking about is not so much that it's like warfare, because warfare is obviously very different and it's much nastier. You don't really want to be in a war, really. But it's performing under pressure. That's really what it's all about. So how does the military perform under pressure? And then secondly, um, understanding what the nature of conflict is. So you can think of rugby as being a conflict. It's often very chaotic. And how do you deal with that? How do you make decisions? And how do you use tactics to improve your performance?
And when did the idea for the Alfred system come alive?
Yeah, so um, it's kind of a long story. Do you want to hear the long story or the short story?
Oh, either or, absolutely up to you.
Okay, well, I guess sort of going back to how I got into this in the first place is that the Army set up effectively a strategy unit to sort of look at what its future requirements would be and how it should best fight future wars. And there were some really good thinkers involved in that. And we used to sort of sit around thinking, you know what, this stuff would actually be really relevant to rugby because for various reasons, we were all heavy Crusaders fans. And so we're saying, oh, we should be doing this or that. And we were watching the All Blacks playing at that time. And I think it might have been Wayne Smith, their head coach, back in the very early 2000s. And there were things sort of that we noticed, like the line out wasn't going terribly well. And we could sort of see that some of these military theories might be applicable to what was going wrong with that line out. So we often talked about, oh, we should try and get in the ears of the All Blacks and explain this stuff to them. And the guy I was working with actually knew Andrew Martin. So if you remember, Andrew Martin was the All Black manager some time ago. I think started under Smithy and might have stayed under John Mitchell as well. And so my mate was always going, "Oh, I'll get you some time with him," but that never eventuated. And then sort of and this is where the story gets a little long, but then we met some people from the US Marine Corps who were really interested in the idea of how chaos applies to warfare. And we started developing models with them and chaos-based combat models. And so we took that, we were doing that with the Army. Then we did some operations over in East Timor. And another piece of fortune, the guy I was working with quite closely in the Army was the commander of the last battalion rotation over there. And he loved our models and he applied it there. And he found that, wow, this is great. This really gave us some really good insights into how we prevent insurgents coming over the border. And it just so happened that one of his juniors was a cousin of Ken Quarry at the rugby union. So suddenly out of the blue, after all this big talk, oh yeah, we'll talk to Andrew Martin, I just get this message out of the blue saying, oh, I've heard that you do combat modeling. Do you think it's relevant to rugby? And that was really all I needed to hear. And that's how it started.
And that's the birthplace of it. So we talk about two different theories, right? Game theory and chaos theory. Can you define them for me?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll just start with chaos theory. So chaos theory, it's obviously a well-established mathematical science, and I'm not going to talk at all about that. I'm just going to really reference how it's kind of relevant, how it's changed science's understanding of the way the universe works. So to me, one of the biggest advances in the last century was understanding the chaotic nature of the world. So all it really means is that uh, small differences have big effects. So, and for that reason, a small change can cause an unpredictable effect. So you can't actually control your team. So if you're a community coach and you're thinking you're going to go in there and you're going to tell this player to do this and that player to do that, and when they go on the field, it's all going to run perfectly. Chances are it won't because of all those little small things that combine together to produce quite often unpredictable outcomes. And the second really important thing to understand with chaos theory is that you can't just understand the whole by looking at the parts. So say if you just look at one player in isolation and you focus on that player and you say you got to do this, you got to do that, and then you go out and the team doesn't work and you think, oh well, I didn't talk to that player clearly enough. That's not sufficient in a chaotic system. You have to look at the whole. So in sports, and there's actually a saying from warfare. In warfare, more than anything else, you must look at the whole as well as the pieces. So I think that's really important to consider. You got to consider, everything, the environment, your structures, your players individually. You can't just look at one or other level and ignore the other ones.
And Al, from a rugby perspective, when you were doing your analytics work and your coaching experience as well, when you were first introduced to these models, what impact did they have on your environments?
I think as Michael alluded to, it's the game. The game is chaotic. I think the biggest insight we had was working with people like King Quarry and Michael and understanding what's going on and what's kind of happening from a statistical perspective within these environments. And then it was a matter of looking at how much actual kind of time we were allocating to these situations and to be able to build the decision making within these situations. And whether, as Michael said, whether we were using it in a part perspective and then a whole perspective. So that's kind of how it eventuated for us. It was first being kind of, this is what the data is telling us. Okay, and then it was kind of coming back together and then having a discussion around, okay, how can we actually train this and how can we create these things within sessions so that we're actually training what's required within the game, not just kind of drills for a better word. So that's why working with people like Michael and Ken was invaluable for us. And then since from my perspective, I guess once people understand within a system, understand their roles, what their responsibilities are within the system and how the system operates, And then it's my job to try and create that chaos and break it and use different parameters and train within that to test it fully. So it's been a real mainstay of my coaching practice for a long time and ever since, really.
So what does that application look like in a training context? Like you take that information on board, how rugby's chaotic and it's unpredictable, and how do you alter your training to make sure your players are ready to perform in that unpredictable environment?
Yeah, so an example for me would be I'm a defensive coach, so I would look at what the ruck defense looked like, and that could be the part training. And then I'd separate the ruck defense with an edge defense. So you've got two separate kind of entities working. And because they have different pictures, the forwards deal with a lot of plays off 9 and things like that, and then obviously the edge have multiple runners, and so you kind of create the part environments for these to operate in. And then once I do that, and we put this add decision making in, and multiple runners, bring in kind of whether it's the defensive line starts static and then they move forward, or do I mix it up and then they have to find their own space and then move forward. So once you kind of do those kind of small little warm up drills and work with those kind of parameters, and then I kind of put it all together, and maybe it'll be 15v15, but I use two multiple balls. So I'll just throw a random ball in, and everyone's got to change to that to react off that ball. Or we may start with a kick chase, or we may start with a lineup. We may start in the scrum, and then we'll throw another ball in. I may send someone off as a yellow card, or so it's just about kind of creating for me, like I say, the part first, so that everyone understands the role of the pictures, the images that they're going to potentially get to see, and then testing it then with the chaotic nature of the game.
Can I jump in there, Max, and just add? So I think that's really great stuff, Al. I think to me, what it's also is another very verification of this idea that you shouldn't overcoach your team. So I know this is something Smithy's really big on as well. And you see it now. It's the modern coaching style. You don't overcoach, don't over instruct your team, because the reality is you can't control everything. So it's effectively and this is what the great military thinkers through history have always known, that you're dealing with a chaotic system. What kind of systems can you put in place to control the chaos? And a really what people have hit on is this idea that you, as much as possible, enable the people who are in the hot seat to do things. So it's kind of like that idea of the coach creates the outline and the players color in the picture. And I think that chaos theory is another piece of evidence that says, yes, this modern way of coaching is actually the right way. And that, as a coach, it's always tempting to be very authoritarian and try and control everything. But it's just realizing you can't, and sort of realizing there's an art as well as a science to coaching.
And I think with Michael as well, with that, I guess it's our job is to inform, to educate the players as best as we can to our ability, so that 100%. They understand what so they can kind of take over and lead. So you end up facilitating. That's kind of how I would see that.
100%.
Giving them the tools and the understanding first and foremost. So that education piece is really, really important.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of delegation, right? You need to empower your leaders to lead on the field.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And I know that's certainly what the All Blacks did when they had their stunning run to the 2011 World Cup, and they actually wrote a paper about all the different things they did. Obviously, when you've got younger players, I tend to think that younger players like to be directed a lot more, so you have to be a little more careful. But it's kind of like trying to find those little opportunities to just empower them just that little bit so that they feel that they own it and that when they go out on the field, because you can't play the game for them, it's letting them understand that they do have a little bit of freedom. And the worst thing by far, and Smithy told me a story about how with one of the teams he was coaching that one of the players would, after a line out, sort of go running way off to the other side of the field, and he's thinking, well, why do you do that? And the reason was because the previous coach had said you have to do that, and that's crazy. You need to play what's in front of you. And the other key concept from that too is the concept of better people make better players. So I think what's really useful as a coach is to always have in mind that you're not just coaching them how to play the sport, you're also teaching them how to expand their mind as people and how to get the most out of the sport. Because let's face it, at the community level, it's a very small number that go on to be elite players. So you want to get as much as you can out of the game. And if you learn those skills, they'll be life skills for you.
And you both talked a lot about both playing smarter and being realistic with your group and your coaching. We'll start with playing smarter. What does playing smarter or coaching smarter look like?
Al, do you want to start?
Well, I think the first thing is as we alluded to is it just depends on the type of the group that you've got. So understand the players that you have. Like that's the first and foremost fundamentally, and as Michael just said, like understand your players, understand who you've got, how they operate, and then you're able to kind of construct a game plan which will allow them to thrive, and then you can kind of work with how to be smart with a game plan with the type of people that you got. So there's no point kind of playing an offload game like the Fijian Drua if you don't have those kind of skills, if you've got in the community game, you've got a big set of heavy forwards, then you probably want to try and create a game that can go from set piece to set piece, and the smarts come with, if you do have that type of game plan, if that's not working, what else can you do within the kind of type of player that you've got? What else can you create that you have a backup plan, if you like, and be able to have something up your sleeve? So if you're a set piece team and your set piece isn't going very well, like can you at least extend the boundaries with them and introduce some form of a kick counter game so they can understand that's always another kind of area and another part of the game that they can go to if the set piece is failing, because that's the smart part. Because I think otherwise, if you've only got one trick up your sleeve and it's not working, then you've got to have the ability to be able to adapt in there.
Yeah, and I didn't actually answer the second part of your question earlier about game theory, and I think game theory is kind of one of the ways that you can get smarter about playing. And all game theory is, if you think about something like paper, scissors, rock. So imagine rugby's paper, scissors, rock. So if you pick the thing that your opposition doesn't know you're going to do, you're going to beat them. Of course, it's not quite so simple in rugby because you might pick rock, and rock actually covers the other two. So you might want an extra option. So it's a question of how many options you want. And I think being smarter is sort of recognizing that you don't necessarily win just by doing the same thing, but just trying to do it better all the time. You also win by thinking about what your strengths are and what options you have. And if rather than just sort of run straight into the defense, what options do you have? Do you have the option to kick over the top of that defense? Do you have the option to sort of try and move the ball around that defense? And creating genuine options is also hugely important. So when you're designing your structures, and it doesn't really matter what level you're at, if you can set up your backline attack so that you're creating 2 or 3 different options, it's going to keep the opposition defense guessing who you're going to go to, and then you'll start to find those holes.
I think also, Michael, it goes. Sorry, Max. It goes back to the skill sets as well, doesn't it? Like if you think about, you would have heard the term of the triple threat. So we can run, we can catch, and we can pass. So at any level, that's really applicable. And that's what as coaches, we should be trying to teach the players that ability so that it does keep defenses on the heels rather than on the toes.
Yeah, absolutely. So coach your team so that they've got the skill set that they can use more than one option. So you might have one player who's a star in your team, and the temptation is just always throw the ball to him, and against a weak team, you'll just run through them because no one can tackle him. But if you start where that falls apart is when you start to play equally strong teams, and then you have to be smart as well as strong and tough.
Yeah, on that, on having multiple options, the easiest example I can think of is having the ball in two hands, right? You don't know whether they're going to pass, they're going to kick, they can take it to the line, they can play late. It's all about deception, right? Another military concept that is applied in high performance sport all around the world. What role does deception play in rugby, and what does a well-designed deceptive play look like? We'll go to you first, Al.
Oh, I I I think these are the kind of things that keep me up at night. Um, because for me, like I would say, a team that has a very, very good deception at the moment would be someone like a Leinster. Okay, because Leinster, from an attack perspective, the skill sets that they have are very consistent within the roles that they play. Okay, so for instance, if you've got a ball carrier, the support runner off the ball carrier will run what we would call a really tight line. So it really kind of always engages the defender so the defender can't push off. So that's the kind of the skill set within that. And that's the kind of thing that's a deception piece because you don't know whether they're going to hit the front ball, as you said, or that you don't know whether they're going to go at the back. And the later defenses are trying to make those decisions, the harder it is for them to kind of keep alive and push to a different kind of player. So that's kind of an example of how that deception works within phase kind of shape. Set piece is another one. Like scrums is very difficult because you could set up one way, and then when the ball is into the scrum, people change pictures. Because if you think of where a lot of the time the defenses are looking at the ball to get to understand when they can get off the line and get the time in. And then once they were looking at the ball, then the attack might have changed a picture late. They might have just moved 2 to 3 steps wider, which is just enough of a picture change to be able to get the defense again to be on their heels rather than their toes. So really, kind of invariably, I think that they're not very big ones generally. But they're kind of really small things that the teams can kind of put on you, and which makes you kind of just second guess yourself. I remember doing some stuff with the Melbourne Storm, and the Melbourne Storm call it the shock tactic. They'd have some kind of a play that the opposition wouldn't have seen, and it's just whether they play that early or whether they play it certain times of the game. It'll just be enough for the defenses to kind of hold and second guess themselves. And then that obviously the game today is line speed, and people want to go fast off the line. But when you've got those kind of deceptions, it's quite hard to be able to bring up that line speed unless you're a Leinster or a South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, so I would, as a really easy example, I would use the one that actually Smithy talks about in his book, which is as your first 5, you're looking at the picture of the other team and where the opposition winger is. So is the winger up or is he back? And that gives you an idea of whether you should kick or whether you're going to run and try and get around their defense because the winger's back. And so he was playing against a guy, sorry, I can't remember his name, but what he would do is he would be up in the line before the play, but the moment it started, he would change his position, so he'd either drop back or come forward, and this was confusing the hell out of Smithy. And it's just simple stuff like that, deceiving your opponent what you're going to do. So I guess sort of trying to relate this back to um, various different levels of coaching. Obviously, the higher level you are coaching at, the more important this stuff becomes and the more relevant. So I would suggest that, it would be easier to hear this stuff and say, right, I'm going to go out and do this with my primary school team or whatever. It's probably just not even going to make sense to them, but just sort of understanding what the appropriate amount is, because it is very difficult for players to remember all that different information and put it together on the field. And if you overcomplicate the picture for them as well, you're probably going to be counterproductive. So it's whether your team, you feel it's capable of using those kinds of deceptions. And if it is, yeah, give it a go.
And I think also with a community game, a scrum is a great place to be. Like you could try those things because invariably you don't have much time. You may have one or two moves, but within those one or two moves, you can say, right, we can set up this way, and then we can change a late picture. Or as Michael said, maybe from a defensive perspective, we could put a wing back to try and take the kick option off, and he can run up late. So even though I think these kind of theories are really applicable for different kind of levels, as long as you try and keep it the basic framework very simple to operate in.
Yeah. And the other thing to consider too is it really going to change the way the opposition plays? So at a higher level, it might, but at a low level, they might just do the same thing regardless what you do.
And where would you put the balance on variety? So lots of different attacking and defending options versus clarity on less options. Is there one that's more valuable than other?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where, to use that dreadful word, mathematics, some of the mathematics from game theory is kind of helpful there. Because in theory, the more options you have, mathematically speaking, the more optimal you can make your attack. But the reality is you can't actually implement that. And what you find if you look at the payoff as you add more and more options, mathematically speaking, the payoff drops and drops and drops. So if you sort of get to about 3 or 4 options, that's probably most of the time as much as you need. And if you're adding more options than that, then you're probably just burdening the cognitive processes of your players more than actually adding value to what you're trying to do. So, yeah, that kind of number of even 2 or 3 options is usually enough to keep the opposition guessing. 4 maybe when you sort of get to the more elite level. And I know that 4 is a number that once again Smithy has sort of talked about, is he feels that is a really good number. I've also heard Razor Robertson talking about how many variations do you actually need, and is it just enough to have 3 or 4 really good ones for things like lineouts or whatever it is, as long as you can keep the opposition guessing and they can't read what you're doing. That's a really key thing. You don't want them to be able to read which option you're going to take, and that's where that kind of idea about genuine options comes into it. If they genuinely can't pick which of the 3 or 4 options you're going to take, that's the situation you want to get to.
So that means that everyone has a role to play, within that move. So you could run it, and everyone's got a role to play. So even if you're not going to get the ball, you still got to look like you're getting the ball. As Michael said, that kind of that
100%.
Deception piece again. So if you're running this 2 or 3 moves, everyone's got it's got to be consistent, and then it's a matter of probably has gone away a little bit from the game these days, but it's just a matter of talking to each other and saying who's free, because invariably someone's going to be free, rather than trying to pre-plan who they're going to hit. But I think that's really important, is everyone's got to look like they're going to get the ball, and that's the kind of the picture that you want to paint.
Yeah, perfectly put, Al.
And Al, from a coach's perspective, how can you obviously players in more high performance environments have a higher baseline of skill and probably do more of these things without being prompted. If you were coaching in the community game, how do you start setting up your team to do those little things well consistently?
I think that's all part of your training. You know, you've got to put a piece to it. And for me, it starts with the clarity piece. So what does it look like? What does it feel like? And try and kind of slow it down enough so people understand where they're going and what they're trying to do. Especially if it's a set piece move. Why I always start with the why. So understand why you're trying to do the move, who you in particular you're trying to target. Whether it's targeted in a certain number in the defensive line, a certain as you go get through the grades and you have access to footage and things like that, then you'll be able to see tendencies of opposition. So that's important, and to getting that clarity and then again blocking maybe 20 minutes, 15 minutes of skill time to be able to kind of execute on the go. I think that's really, really important. Those two kind of really important parts to start with. And I think we are all as coaches, we all want more time. But if it's really, really important for you, you would find a way to be able to fit it in.
Yep. And as the game becomes a bit more data heavy and more teams have access to footage and players are GPS more often, particularly at higher levels, what are some traps you see teams fall into when they're analyzing footage?
Yeah, I think that's a huge Pandora's box, really. I think even at the elite level, analysts struggle with that question because you know, the traditional. Well, it wasn't even that long ago that using video analysis was sort of an innovation, but the number of things you can do now is just incredible. Um, but the ways that that can go wrong is equally incredible. And I think that's particularly if you're sort of thinking at the community level, that can really go wrong easily. Um, and I think what's really important to be aware of is cognitive biases. They're going to, this stuff, a lot of it is very subjective and there's a lot of an art to it. So we all tend to see what we want to see. And that applies whether you're looking at the game in real time or if you're watching the video later or you're looking at some stats. You'll tend to sort of see the things that confirm your existing biases. So I think that it is at the community level is probably the most important trap to be aware of. And we all know this saying, lies, damn lies, and statistics. Well, that's what you're dealing with, really. So probably one of the simplest traps would be, say, if you had someone who was taking some stats and their job was, and what I'm not talking about elite level here, just someone on the sideline at your local rugby game, and they're noting down who knocks the ball on, and then you sort of come up with a chart. These players knock the ball on the most. So I mean, hopefully it's obvious what the problem with that is, which is that some positions just carry the ball a lot more. So those players are going to knock the ball on more. But it would be very easy to say, oh, this player knocks the ball on all the time. But you don't know if that player is actually any worse or better than any of the others there. So it's just kind of, just being aware of that sort of trap. And the reality is that statistics is it's a university level subject for a reason. It's not that easy to do. So you need to be a little careful not to feel that just because you take down some numbers, that means you're using the statistics well, or that you're necessarily even adding much to your team. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Al?
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. And I think that like how we use them and how I still use them is it's an indicator as to an area that might make me go and have a look at the video and get more context to the numbers. And if you've done it, for a number of times and you understand what you're trying to look for, and you've got a kind of a so-called benchmark, Whether you're going below that benchmark or above that benchmark, there'll be a reason for it, and put some context with it with the video. So I think that it's not just one. It works in with a suite of kind of tools to be able to help you paint a picture. There's a number of times that even now environments that I've been where you see something on the video, and from a player's perspective, they know the game, especially at an elite level, and you say, "Well, I've seen this. Do you think this will work because of this reason?" And the video will only show you maybe a certain angle, and the player themselves will go, "No, that's never going to work." So if you've got that experienced player who understands the game a little bit more, then it's a really good opportunity to include them in what you're trying to plan as well, because they'll be able to give you some good honest feedback, I think, of whether something's going to work or not. So that's another example of the bias, kind of can play tricks on you as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's a layer of information, isn't it, that may help add to your bigger picture. But it's like we were talking before, you got to look at it holistically. It's the trap with doing statistics is that it looks scientific, but you got to remember it isn't really, because if you were doing it scientifically, you would actually need a whole lot of extra information to make that scientifically valid.
Are there any stats from a rugby context through the different environments you've been in that you'd say are important metrics to performance?
Yeah, I think ultimately if I take a helicopter view, I don't think the game has changed in a laws perspective, but the purpose of the game, it hasn't changed. You still got to go forward. So how are you going to go forward? Like for me, defensively, I look at where the teams are we going forward, or is the other team going forward? If we're not going forward, what's the speed of the ball? Can we slow the ball down? Because the opposition attack want fast ball. Defensively, we want slow ball. So those are kind of really simple stats, but they're highly relevant because that's the game. So for me, that's where it all kind of starts with is things like what game line, ball speed. Is there continuity in the game from an attack perspective? I kind of keeping the ball alive that people talk about. Can you execute your set piece? Like just simple things like that, which are highly relevant across all the different game, different levels.
Yeah, I think when I heard your question, Max, it's just sort of a vision of huge spreadsheets that I work with that just has huge amounts of information in them. Thinking,
Yeah.
okay, but people definitely have looked at like what are the most important factors to winning, and the reality is that rugby is played so differently by so many different teams that it's actually hard to know exactly which one it is. So I like what Al was saying there, that it's kind of, just think what the simple basic nature of the game is. It's effectively getting over the gain line more than your opposition does, and doing that enough that you will probably on average score more points than they do. But I've seen things like people have said, well, we've run a machine learning algorithm on this, and what we found is that tackle completion rate is the factor to success. But then you go and look at something like the last Rugby World Cup, where the Springboks had the poorest tackle completion, and then they won the competition. So what does that tell you? There's always a bit of an art to these things as well as the science.
And I think also, Max, you can get lost in the data.
Absolutely.
So us, I guess the job for us coaches is to make that kind of the complicated simple. So finding those for your team is really quite relevant. Is spending some time as to what is it exactly, how I see the game as a coach. How can I measure that? How can I measure it? And then just showing the real key ones that you think lead to a good performance, and trying to keep it kind of as light and as simple as possible. is an art in itself, isn't it, Michael? Like, I know you and I have many conversations over. Okay, but how do we? What's the kind of the simple thing? How do we keep it simple to be able to present to the players? You know,
Yeah,
there's kind of different levels to it, isn't there?
100% Al. And yeah, I think when we sort of talk about chaos theory, it makes it seem like we're trying to make things complicated, but we're not. And that thing that Al
Mm.
just said about, our job is really to make the complicated simple. And I think if coaches follow that mantra, make the complicated simple, then you'll do well.
I
And
think
and I think when it comes to statistics, it's what's actually relevant to what you're trying to do as a coach. That's what you should be focusing on. So don't worry about trying to collect information about absolutely everything. Just think about what's relevant to you and then try and collect some information on that.
Yeah, I think a few key themes over the last half an hour of our conversation is simple is better, and clarity is way more valuable than having 10 to 12 different options off set piece, off shapes, whether that's attack and defense. Um, Rugby is a chaotic sport, and you need to empower your leaders, particularly on the field leaders, to make smart decisions in that under that pressure and in that chaos. And also that as a coach, your job is to keep things simple and deliver simple messages and try and empower your players to make really calm decisions and get good outcomes. Um, Before we leave you today, Michael, now any closing comments, any last things you'd like to get out there on game or chaos theory?
Yeah, well, I think we've seen the term chaos sort of thrown around a lot in recent times. And I think that does go back to a newspaper article or stuff that Smithy's been sort of putting out there about using chaos. And what I really admire about Smithy is that he has this amazing ability to summarize a complicated idea in just one word. And in this case, he's chosen chaos. Probably technically speaking, he doesn't really mean chaos. He probably means more like just smart game theory. Um, but I think really what we're trying to say with this is that too much structure is counterproductive, but you got to have enough structure. So one of the things about chaos is actually different from randomness. It's really important for people to understand that. So
Mm.
chaos is kind of that where you're on the edge of um, unpredictability. It's kind of the boundary between structure and complete randomness. So it's kind of enough structure that you can make things happen and create these options and potentially create deceptions and whatever else, but not so much structure that it becomes very rigid and inflexible. Because um, I love using warfare analogies to sort of think about how Napoleon beat the Prussians. Um, was that Napoleon was able to use his forces very flexibly. The Prussians were very, very rigid in what they did. So when things started going bad for the Prussians, they couldn't adapt and they would just sort of panic and fall to pieces, basically. Even though they were the most feared military machine in Europe at that time. Whereas Napoleon was able to, because he did use all this delegation and understood the inherently chaotic nature of warfare, he was able to adjust more. So try to think of yourself a little bit like that, no matter what level of coach you are, that you're not trying to coach something really, really rigid, because if you hit the wrong situation, it'll fall to bits. You always need to be able to adapt to what you find. And the best way to do that is to empower your players and to be relatively simple and not overcomplicate, and particularly not overstress the cognitive capacity of your players.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I love that, and I think like what I would say to the coaches is have a think about how much time you allocate in your week, in your training sessions to, this kind of theory and the um, the unpredictability. Most coaches, like I say, due to limited time, have a Tuesday and they just may go set McKay split, and it'll be a backs go do their thing, forwards do their thing, come together, and a little bit of a team run, and then kind of that's it, you know. And but it's a big part of the game. It is the game. So yes, set piece is important, but maybe, you know, there's an opportunity for you to think about how you can bring some of this into your training and be able to create the environment that your players can practice this kind of thing, so that when they get to these situations on a Saturday, then you know, they would have been through them in the week, and hopefully they can thrive in the chaos.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting one, Al, particularly for coaches in the community spaces where you obviously don't have a whole lot of time. How can you best use that time? And the best use of that time, given how chaotic rugby is as a sport, probably isn't your backs going and doing strikes for 30 minutes, your forwards doing 25 lineouts. You do a 10-minute team run and you call it a day, right? There needs to be some sort of chaos or game likeness in that training to get the best out of players for the weekend.
Yeah, 100% skill set. So you've got to practice your skill sets. You need to put that in, you know, your kind of your basic skills, you catch, pass, tackle. And then, you know, so you factor in your skill set, you factor in obviously your the time allocated to simple moves, as we talked about. Not many. You don't need many. You just need as Michael said, 3, maybe 4, and then make sure that everyone's running the same way, and then you pick your options off that. So that shouldn't take that long, really, once you get the kind of the clarity piece in. And then, you know, how much time could you allocate? Could you kind of increase your team run to include some of these kind of theories, and create the environment for them to start to learn and start to adapt real time? Certainly possible. So it's a good challenge.
Yeah, that whole thing with limited time. Yeah, I mean that's the huge thing on coaches, isn't it? That you only get them for a short time and you can't say everything. But I think that's where the idea of the more that you can get your players to identify for themselves what they need to work on today, where they think they need to focus, and you know, just give them that freedom, get away from being too rigid about how you deal with them. Obviously, that's not going to work so well with more junior players, but as they become older and are more capable of taking on some of that responsibility, I think as a coach you can benefit enormously by using, you know, think of it as a computer. You're one computer, your brain, and you've got 15 other computers that you're not using. If you're just the guy standing in the middle telling everyone exactly what to do, if you can use some of their computing power as well, that's going to really help you. And you know, that idea, it sounds like a totally different thing from chaos, but actually that resonates really well with chaos theory. This idea that one person can't control it, you actually need your system to be flexible enough, which means the players themselves thinking, what do we need to do? How can we make ourselves better, as well as the coach?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and no doubt we could go on for hours. But thanks, Al. Thanks, Michael, for your time this morning or this evening. Really appreciate picking your brains. It's been really interesting to hear about chaos theory, how it applies to rugby in the chaotic environment. Some awesome bits of knowledge there for coaches around both session planning and how they can use data analysis better in their environments. So thanks a lot for your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much, Max
Thanks,
and Al.
Max. Great to see you, Michael.
Yeah, good to see you, Al.